Welcome to the ASP.NET Core Web API class. This is Patrick from patrickvideos.com. So what exactly is Web API? When you create an application, you may want different types of UIs. You may want a browser-based UI, a mobile application, watch, Alexa and Google devices, and even other team projects to access your application. So how do you make your application accessible to all these types of UIs? In comes Web API. If you use Web APIs in your application, all these front ends can request and receive the response in JSON format. This is the very basics of Web API. To have a better understanding, let us create a project. So let's get started. In Visual Studio, let us create a new project. And here, select ASP.NET Core Web Application. Make sure it is C#. Now, if you are not able to see this template, go to the Visual Studio installer, go to Modify, and make sure you select ASP.NET and Web Development over here, and scroll all the way down and select .NET Core Cross-Platform Development. So here, let me select ASP.NET Core Web Application, click on Next. And let us give a name for our project. I'm going to call this Bookstore API. We will see the meaning of API and all those things later on. Let us first create a project and then I will explain to you the architecture and the use of the API. Let us select a location for the project. Let me click on Create. Here in the drop-down, select ASP.NET Core 5.0 and select ASP.NET Core Web API. No authentication and enable OpenAPI support. Click on Create. Now that we have created the project, first let us go over here and select web browser as Google Chrome. The web APIs work much better in Google Chrome than in IE. Now let's just run this application. Click on Debug, Start without debugging, and you can see that the web API works. We will learn about what Swagger is at a later time, but this page proves that the Web API works. Now to understand how this works, let us go learn by creating a new controller. So here, right click on the controllers folder and click on Add Controller. Here select API and select API Controller Empty. Click on Add. And let us create a controller called Values Controller. And click on Add. So we now have a controller called Values Controller. In this Values Controller, let us write two methods. You can copy paste this code from the attached source code. So here you can see that we have two methods, one called get, which takes in no parameters, and another method also called get, which takes in one parameter called ID. Both of them, if you notice, are called HTTP GET methods. Now let's run this application again. Click on Debug, Start without debugging. And here, make sure to go to this URL that you have and type in, instead of weather forecast, type in /API/values. And you will see these values called values 1, 2, 3, and 4. So what exactly is happening over here? So let's look at the architecture of Web API. Web API, all requests go to a controller. All requests go to a controller, a Web API controller, and the values are returned back to the UI. So now let us go back to our project and see how does this call a controller and how does the controller return the value. So when we ran this project and we typed in /API/values, what happened was it called the values controller. You can see that this values controller can be called by using this route called API/whatever the controller name is. So since the controller name was values controller, when you typed in /API/values, it called this values controller. By default, whenever you call a controller, the get method of the controller gets executed. the HTTP get method gets executed. So it executed this HTTP get method and it returned these 4 values that we saw over there. We saw these 4 values because the request went to the controller. Since we requested the API/values controller, it went here, it called the default HTTP get method and returned it back to the UI. If you add in one more value and run this, and if you try this /API/values, you will notice that we also see this values 5 right now. Let's go click on stop. Now by default, it is calling the weather forecast controller. You can see that the weather forecast controller was returning the get method, but let us not look into this method. It's too complex for you to look at it right now. But how did it call this weather forecast controller by default? In properties, if you go to launch settings.json, you will notice that the launch URL is weather forecast. If you change this to API/values, the launch URL by default will go to API/values instead of weather forecast. Let's save and run this. Now if you run this, you can see that by default it goes to /API/values. Now you may ask, like, why should I write /API/values, whereas for weather forecast I just have to type in weather forecast? The reason is if you notice, in the weather forecast controller, the route has only the controller name, whereas in the values controller we have it as API/controller name. So weather forecast controller only has the controller name and values as API/controller name. If you want only the controller name to be mentioned, you can delete this API/controller. You can leave it at this as only controller name, and in launch settings you can simply call the values controller. Debug start without debugging. You see that it works fine. You no longer need to use API/values. But let me use API/values because I want to know if I'm calling a web API or a regular controller. So I prefer to call it as API/values. And I'm going to put the API over here too. So now you know that whenever you start your application, by default there is a request, and that request goes to a controller, and the controller's HTTP get method gets executed and it returns a value. Now that we saw how to call the first get method, let us learn how to call the second get method. This get method takes in some kind of a parameter. So let's run this. Now if I type in /values and say /5, you can see that it is calling the second get method. How does that work? Now when I type in API/values/5, it comes in search of a HTTP get method, but there is only one get method here which takes in some kind of a parameter, some kind of a value. Here you can see that it takes an integer. So it knows that it has to call this get method that takes in an ID or some kind of a number. And then it returns the words the value is, appending whatever number you send in. If I say /values/9, you will notice that the value is 9. Because it came here, the 9 came here, and then it created the sentence the value is 9 and it returned the value. You can even debug this by putting a breakpoint. Click on debug, start debugging. And here you can say API/values/9. Here you can see that it came with the value 9. You can just go hover on top of that ID, or you can right click and click on add watch, and you will see that the value is 9 over here. Step over step over, and then you will see that the value is 9 is being displayed right here. Let's stop this. Next, let us create another folder in this project, and let's call this folder as models. So we have created a new folder called models in this bookstore API project. In this models folder, let us add a class, and let's call this class as book with these properties. Make sure to copy paste this from the source code. So we now have a book class with these properties. Now let us create one more controller called the books controller. Right click on controllers, add controller. Make sure it is an API controller empty. Click on add, and let's call this books controller and click on add. So we know that to call this controller, we have to say /API/books. In this books controller, let us put a bunch of data. We are going to create a list of books. So we are going to say, make sure using bookstore API.models. Make sure to copy paste this data from the source code. We are just creating a bunch of books or a list of books. And below this list of books, we are going to create two methods, two HTTP GET methods. So one method is getAllBooks, which simply returns this list of books. You can see that right here. It returns something called as an action result IEnumerable of book. So basically it returns a list of books. And the second method, getBook, which takes in an ID, queries this list of books. You can see that books.first.default, x becomes x.id. Whatever ID you supply, it's going to query this list of books, and it's going to check. If the book is null, it's going to return not found. If the book is available, it's simply going to return that book as an action result. So web APIs usually return an action result. Now you may wonder, why does these HTTP GET methods return action result, whereas in the values controller, we simply return the string or an IEnumerable of string? What is the difference? Well, if you have very simple data to return, like I have a string or some integer, then you can simply return those data. This works fine. But if you have some complex returns, like I want to give a 404 error, I want to give a not found message. So in those cases, you need to use action result. So action result will not only return the data, it will also help you give out some messages to the people who are calling your APIs. So in this case, you can see that if the book is not available, it will return a not found message, else it will return the book. So now let's run this. Debug start without debugging, or you can debug this if you want. We can call it by saying /API/books. You can see that it has returned all the JSON objects. It went to the books controller, it executed the HTTP GET method that takes in no ID, and it returned the entire list of books. If you want to call the other method, you need to supply an ID. So we're going to say /API/books/ let's say 4, and we got the title 4. If we supply some other number like say 25, we receive the not found status, that is the 404 status. So all requests go to the controller, and depending on what parameters you send, it will either call the HTTP GET method that takes in no parameters, or the HTTP GET method that takes in some kind of a parameter. Now let us test this web API controller using Postman. So we are going to call the web API controller using Postman. Postman is a tool used to test these controllers. So let's download Postman and use it. To download Postman, search for Postman and select download Postman. Let's download the app. In Postman, make sure that in settings, over here in the upper right hand side corner, select settings and make sure the SSL certificate verification is turned off. Now let us go back to our project, run our project, and run the same request using Postman. So we are going to call this request. So let us copy this request. Go to Postman, make sure you use the get over here and paste the URL and click on send. You will notice that the Postman made a request to your controller and returned all the values right here as JSON objects. This is a much better display. Same way, if you want to search for one particular book, like say book ID 5, the girls, we received another JSON object for that particular book. We can debug this application. I'm going to put a breakpoint right here. Click on debug, start debugging, and we'll go to Postman and we'll click on send right here. So it will come here. You can see that the number 5 has come right here. It is going to search for the book from the list of books right here. Step over. The book is not null and it's going to return this book. You can see that the book has all these values right here. You can click on continue. So all requests go to the controller. It searches depending on what are the parameters in the controller. It fetches the value and returns it back to the Postman. Now that we have seen how API controllers get called, let us separate this data from the APIs. We want to bring in another layer called bookstore.data, which will hold the data, and later on we will make this layer connect to the database, and we will keep the APIs, the API controllers, separate. So we are going to create another project called bookstore.data. So here in the solution, right click on the solution, not on the project. You need to right click on the solution and click on add new project. Here search for class library and select class library .NET Core C#. So make sure it is C# class library .NET Core. Click on next and let's call this bookstore.data. So we have another project, a .NET class library called bookstore.data. Let us delete this default class and let us create 3 new folders in this data layer. The folders are going to be called models, interfaces, and repositories. Models, interfaces, repositories. First, let us move the book.cs, this class, from the models folder over here to the models folder over there. So we can right click on copy, right click on the models and paste it over here. Once we paste this, make sure to change the namespace. The namespace now should be bookstore.data.models. And over here, this book.cs, I'm going to comment it out. You can delete it. So I'm going to comment out this book.cs. You can delete it. You can also exclude it. Right click, exclude from project. And if the file disappears, you can simply go click on show all files to show the files here as a hidden file. I'm going to keep it as included so that you can always see this file right here. So in the bookstore.data project, we now have the book model class. Now let us create an interface. And let's call this interface as iBook repository. This is going to be a public interface. And this interface is going to have two methods, getAllBooks, which returns a list of books, and getBook, which takes in an ID and returns a book. Make sure you resolve this using the bookstore.data.models folder. Just follow along. I will explain to you the architecture of this later on. Now let us create a class to implement this interface. Add class. In the repositories folder, I'm going to create a class called book repository. Let's call this public. And implements iBook repository. Make sure you use the correct using statement. And make sure to implement the interface. Now let's move the data from the books controller to the book repository. So I'm going to copy this and have it commented over here. And let's go to the book repository and paste the code over here. So in the book repository, we now have the data. So what we are doing is we are taking the data away from the controller and putting it in the bookstore.data layer, so that our controllers can be clean and it will only have the API controllers. If it wants the data, it has to go to the data layer. Now in the getAllBooks, we are going to return the list of books. So it's going to be return books. So it's going to return the list of books. And for the getBookById, we need to write a link statement. So here you can see that return books.first.default. For first.default to work, you need to have using system.link. And we have x.id equal to id. So whatever id comes in right here, it's going to query it and return that book. So now that we have moved our data to its own layer, it has an interface, an implementation of the interface and all those things. Let's go and make use of this data right here in the Bookstore API. So in the Bookstore API books controller, you can see that it no longer understands where this book is coming from, because it has no longer a reference to the book class. So what we can do is, so now we can add the bookstore.data layer as a reference in the Bookstore API project. So in the dependencies, right click on the Bookstore API dependencies, click on add project reference and select bookstore.data. Click on OK. So we now have the bookstore.data project referred in the Bookstore API. So now you can go and resolve this book. You can see that you can now use using bookstore.data.models. But of course, it's still not able to understand what is this return books here doing. Our data is now here in this book repository, which is an implementation of iBook repository. So we can refer to this particular repository right here in our controller. We can do something like this. We can say private iBook repository books equal to new book repository. Make sure to resolve it. Equal to new book repository. Make sure to resolve these. So here you can see that we now have books pointing to the book repository class, which has the data right here. Now it is not required to say private iBook repository books equal to new book repository. It is not required. You can simply say, you can even use public over here, book repository books equal to new book repository. We can do it like this, and then later on, let me show you the advantage of using iBook repository right here. So for now, we now have a reference to this class, this book repository class, which has the data. in the books controller. Make sure to save everything. Of course, now this book repository has the methods to get all the books. So we can call this get all books right here in the books controller. So now we can say books.get all books. And for the get book with ID, we can call the book repositories get book with ID. So here, instead of calling this line, we are going to say books.getBook, and we are going to pass in the ID. So this method is now going to call the book repositories getBook method, which will return a book. The book repositories getBook method will return a book. And if the book is available, it will return the book. If not, it will return not found. So now let's test this out. Debug, start with the debugging. Let's see what the build errors are. We need to remove references like bookstoreapi.models because we no longer have the models folder having any values right here. So let's remove this. Let's start again. And let me go to the Postman and query the data. It works fine. You can see that it works fine. We can debug it by going to book repository. We can put a breakpoint right here. In the books controller, let us put a breakpoint over here. So first it will call the books controller method, and then it will call the book repositories method. Let's run this, debug, start debugging. And in Postman, I'm going to call the get method passing a number 5. So it first goes to the books controller, the get book ID, which in turn calls the book repositories get book by ID. The book repositories get book by ID, which then returns the value back to the controller and back to the UI using the action result. So when you look at the architecture right now, the Postman sends a request, it goes to the controller then calls the bookstore.data layer, which has the book repository, fetches the data and sends it back to the controller, which then sends it back to Postman. So let's look at the architecture using this picture. The Postman sends a request to the books controller. The books controller HTTP get method has the book repository pointing to this book repository right here. So it calls this method from the bookstore.data and sends it back right here to the bookstore API back to Postman.